Is that your name tape, or did it lose the will to serve before you did? Captain Ethan Brooks said it with a light laugh, the kind of laugh men use when they want a room to know they noticed something first. The records office at Naval Station Norfolk went quiet around him. The scanner stopped humming for half a second. A clerk at the far cabinet paused with a folder in her hand. Rain tapped softly against the narrow windows, turning the gray Virginia morning into a blurred sheet of water and light. Lieutenant Commander Grace Walker stood at the service counter with a sealed file under one arm, her posture straight, her expression calm, and the right edge of her name tape torn enough that only the letters WALK remained clear on the dark fabric of her uniform. She was 36, white, with dark blonde hair pulled into a regulation bun and blue-gray eyes that seemed to measure a room without asking permission from it. Her face was striking, not because it tried to be, but because it carried the kind of quiet endurance that made people look twice before they understood why. Above her left pocket sat a small polished badge that did not belong to the standard uniform issue, a silver shield crossed by a narrow eagle wing, bright and immaculate against everything else that looked used, practical, and worn by time. The torn name tape should have been the smallest thing in the room. Ethan made it the loudest. He stood behind the counter in a crisp navy uniform, 40 years old, white, broad-shouldered, clean-shaven, with sharp eyes and a reputation for finding errors other officers missed. He had built his career on standards, records, signatures, dates, chain of custody, uniform regulations, and the belief that details revealed the truth before people did. That belief had helped him survive 7 years of unanswered questions about his older brother, Daniel Brooks, a Navy SEAL who had disappeared into a sealed mission and never came back, with a proper explanation attached to his name. But Ethan did not know that the woman standing in front of him had carried a piece of Daniel's story through silence, rain, and years of locked doors. He only saw the torn strip of cloth on her chest and the old file in her hand. "Lieutenant Commander," he said, still smiling just enough to let the room hear judgment without calling it disrespect. "If your name cannot stay attached to your uniform, how am I supposed to trust the file attached to it?" Grace did not look down at the tear. She had looked at it enough in private. She had felt its edge beneath her fingers on nights when memory found her before sleep did. Instead, she placed the file on the counter with both hands, careful and exact, as if the folder itself deserved more respect than the man currently mocking it. Its cover was faded from age. One corner had a water stain. The paper tie around it had been replaced twice and still looked too fragile for ordinary handling. A red administrative seal crossed the front, stamped with restricted review language. Ethan's smile thinned. He disliked damaged files almost as much as damaged uniforms. Grace met his eyes and answered in a voice, so even it made the silence in the room feel intentional. "Names stay attached in different ways, Captain." The clerk by the cabinet lowered her gaze. Someone behind the glass partition shifted uneasily. Ethan heard the sentence as attitude, the polished kind officers used when they did not want to admit a mistake. He reached for the file, but Grace's hand remained resting lightly on top of it for one more second. Not stopping him, not challenging him, just giving him a chance to understand that he was about to touch something heavier than paperwork. He missed the warning. "This better not be another incomplete legacy review," he said. "I have a stack of those already." Grace lifted her hand. "It is complete enough to reopen one." Ethan pulled the folder toward him. "Whose?" Grace's eyes flicked once to the rain-streaked window, then back to him. "Daniel Brooks." The name entered the room quietly, but it changed the air like a door closing behind everyone inside. Ethan's fingers stopped on the file tie. For the first time, his expression lost its practiced edge. He looked at Grace, then at the torn name tape, then back at the folder. "Say that again," he said. Grace did not raise her voice. "Daniel Brooks." Ethan Brooks did not untie the file right away. His hand stayed on the faded folder, but his mind had moved 7 years back to a front porch in Ohio, where his mother had stood in a cardigan too thin for the weather while 2 officers told the family that Daniel was missing. Not confirmed gone. Not confirmed safe. Missing. That word had become a room the Brooks family never fully left. It sat at birthdays, at Christmas dinners, in the empty chair no one wanted to move, in the photographs his father kept straightening on the mantel as if order could make grief behave. Ethan had joined the administrative side of command partly because paperwork had failed his family. Somewhere, He believed a name had been mishandled, a report had been closed too soon, a signature had been placed on a page before the truth was ready. Now that name had come out of Grace Walker's mouth inside a records office on a rainy morning, carried by a woman whose torn name tape he had laughed at less than a minute earlier. "How do you know my brother's name?" he asked. His voice was lower now, stripped of the dry humor that had filled the room before. Grace kept her hands at her sides. "Because I was assigned to the same recovery file." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "There was no recovery file released to the family." "No," she said. "There was not." The honesty in that answer did not comfort him. It made the old anger stand up inside him, sharp and disciplined. The clerk near the cabinet quietly stepped away from the aisle, giving the counter more space without being told. Rain ran down the glass in thin, crooked lines. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Everything ordinary in the room suddenly felt too loud. Ethan looked at the file seal again. Restricted review. Legacy case. Supplemental evidence. His thumb moved over the paper tie, but did not pull it open. "Who authorized you to bring this here?" Grace reached into the inner pocket of her uniform and placed a folded transfer memo beside the folder. Naval Special Warfare Command. Office of Records Integrity. Family Notification Review, pending verification. Ethan read the heading, then the signature block, then the date. His face changed by degrees, not enough for most people to notice, but Grace noticed. She had spent too many years reading men who thought stillness made them unreadable. "You should have led with that," he said. "You led with the name tape," Grace answered. The words were not sharp. That made them worse. Ethan looked up. For the first time, he truly studied her. The torn strip on her chest, the immaculate silver shield and eagle badge, the old calm in her eyes, the way she had not defended herself when he mocked something personal. He realized then that she had not been embarrassed by the tear. She had been protecting its meaning. "Why is your name tape damaged?" he asked, though his tone no longer carried accusation. Grace glanced down once, not at the cloth itself, but at the line where the right edge had frayed and never been replaced. "It happened during the same night Daniel handed me something he wanted preserved." Ethan's fingers tightened on the file. "What did he hand you?" Grace did not answer immediately. She looked toward the other employees in the room. Ethan understood and turned his head. "Clear the front area." No one argued. Chairs shifted. The clerk closed a cabinet drawer softly. A petty officer gathered 2 folders and disappeared through the side door. Within seconds, the public counter became a private space without walls. Ethan came around from behind the desk and stood on the same side as Grace, not close, but no longer separated by the counter. The old file lay between them. "Open it," he said. Grace's expression did not change. "You should be ready before you do." Ethan almost laughed again, but there was no pride left in it. "Lieutenant Commander, I have been ready for 7 years." Grace looked at him with something that might have been pity if it had been softer. "No, Captain. You have been waiting for 7 years. That is not the same thing." The sentence landed harder than any insult could have. Ethan looked away first. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere beyond the base, distant and low. He reached for the paper tie and began unfastening the file with careful hands. The knot resisted at first, stiff from age. When it finally loosened, the folder opened with the dry whisper of paper that had been closed too long. Inside were memorandums, sealed statements, faded location grids, and a smaller envelope tucked beneath the first page. Ethan lifted the page. The envelope slid forward, caught on the file edge, and dropped to the floor between them. A photograph slipped halfway out. Grace closed her eyes for one brief second. Ethan bent down, picked it up, and turned it over. The room disappeared. In his hand was Daniel Brooks, younger than Ethan remembered him now, smiling in field gear beside a transport aircraft under a dusty gold sky. On the back, written in dark ink, were 5 words that made Ethan forget how to breathe. Daniel Brooks, last confirmed alive. Ethan Brooks held the photograph with both hands, not because it was fragile, but because he was. For 7 years, every official image of Daniel had been clean, formal, and useless. Dress uniform at graduation, family picture in the backyard, a framed portrait chosen by people who wanted grief to look respectable. This photograph was different. Daniel was dusty, tired, and alive in a way paper was not supposed to make someone feel. His smile was smaller than Ethan remembered, but it was there. The same crooked lift on the left side. The same stubborn brightness in his eyes. Behind him stood a transport aircraft with its ramp lowered, cargo straps hanging loose, sunlight turning the air gold around his shoulders. Ethan stared at the words on the back again. Daniel Brooks. Last confirmed alive. His throat moved once before sound came out. Who wrote this? Grace Walker stood beside the counter, silent for a beat too long. I did. Ethan looked up slowly. The room had changed shape around her. A few minutes ago, she had been an officer with a torn name tape and a file he did not trust. Now she was the last hand connected to a photograph his family had never seen. His eyes moved to the frayed cloth on her chest, then to the polished silver shield crossed by the eagle wing. The tear no longer looked like neglect. It looked like evidence. You saw him after the last report? Ethan asked. Grace nodded once. Yes. Alive. Yes. The answer was simple, but it broke something open in him. Not peace. Not yet. But a locked room in his chest found air. Ethan stepped back until his shoulder touched the edge of the records counter. He looked down at the file, then at the photograph, then at Grace. The official statement said his team lost contact before final extraction. That statement was incomplete. Incomplete, Ethan repeated, and bitterness tried to return because bitterness was familiar. That is a careful word. Grace accepted that. It is the only word I can use in this room. Ethan studied her face, searching for evasion. He found none. He found restraint, which was harder to argue with. Grace looked toward the closed side door where the clerks had gone, then back to him. Your brother was not a line item to me, Captain. He was not a missing entry, not a delayed notification, not a signature waiting for clearance. He was Daniel. He talked about Ohio. He carried a photo of your family folded into the back of his notebook. He said your mother made terrible coffee, but acted offended if anyone refused a second cup. Ethan's eyes changed. It was too specific to be invented, too ordinary to be strategic. He looked down at the photograph again, and this time he saw the edge of another person in the frame, just a sleeve, just part of a shoulder. Dark uniform, a flash of silver near the pocket. He turned the photo slightly under the fluorescent light. Is that you? Grace did not look away. Yes. Ethan's breath left him quietly. Why were you cut out? Grace's mouth tightened by a fraction. I was not supposed to be in the photograph. Because of the mission? Because of the people who needed the mission to remain simple on paper. Rain pressed harder against the windows, steady and cold. Ethan had spent years blaming faceless systems, but systems were made of decisions, and decisions were made by people who slept at night because other people carried the weight for them. Tell me what happened, he said. Grace's gaze moved to the file. I can tell you what the review authorizes. Ethan's face hardened. That is not what I asked. It is what I can give you without losing the chance to reopen the case properly. That stopped him. Grace was not withholding the truth to protect herself. She was protecting the process that might finally give his family more than rumor. Ethan looked at the torn name tape again. You said the damage happened that night. Grace's fingers touched the frayed edge for the first time since she entered the room. Daniel grabbed my sleeve before we separated. He pushed the photo into my file cover and said, if this survives, make sure my brother knows I was still standing when the story stopped. Ethan closed his eyes. The office was silent except for rain, the buzz of lights, and the old paper breathing open on the counter. When he opened them, the officer who had laughed was gone. In his place stood a younger brother with rank on his collar and regret in his hands. I laughed at the wrong thing, he said. Grace answered quietly. You laughed before you knew what it carried. Grace Walker did not look pleased by Ethan Brooks's regret. She had seen regret arrive too late too many times to mistake it for repair. It could open a door, but it could not walk through it for anyone. Ethan stood beside the counter with Daniel's photograph in his hands, the rain outside turning the windows silver behind him. The records office felt smaller now, not because the walls had moved, but because the truth had taken up space no one could ignore. Grace reached for the file and carefully turned the next page. The review allows 3 confirmed facts, she said. First, Daniel Brooks was alive after the last official contact time. Second, he transferred personal evidence to me before the final separation. Third, the original record did not include all witness statements available at the time. Ethan looked at her. Why? Grace kept her eyes on the page. Because some reports are written to close a question, not answer it. The sentence landed with the quiet force of a gavel. Ethan wanted to be angry, and part of him was, but anger had nowhere clean to go. Not at Grace. Not now. She had carried the photograph when others had buried the question. She had stood in front of him with a torn name tape and let him mock the only visible scar this room was allowed to see. Who left it out, he asked. Grace turned another page, revealing a photocopied statement with heavy black redactions across half the lines. That is what the review board is reopening. And you came here because my office controls the archive chain. Yes. And because I am Daniel's brother. She paused. Yes. Ethan looked down at the photo again. Daniel's face stared back from a year the family had been told ended differently. You could have sent this through channels. I tried. Grace's answer was immediate, flat, and tired in a way that made Ethan understand it was not the first attempt. Twice, he asked. 5 times. He looked up. 5. Requests returned for procedural deficiency. Evidence marked duplicative. Witness statement pending clearance. Legacy review deferred. Each phrase sounded like the kind of language Ethan had used himself, clean enough to hide the human being underneath. He felt that realization settle heavily across his shoulders. Grace did not soften it for him. I learned that if I wanted the file opened, I needed to place it in front of someone who had both authority and a reason not to look away. Ethan's face tightened. So this morning was planned. The delivery was planned, she said. Your comment was not. That quiet correction made him lower his eyes. The torn name tape seemed to stand between them now, not as accusation, but as record. I owe you more than an apology, he said. Grace closed the file halfway and placed her hand on top of it. No, you owe the file accuracy. You owe your family patience. You owe your brother the discipline not to turn one photograph into the whole truth before the review is complete. Ethan nodded slowly, because she was right, and because he hated how much strength it took not to demand everything at once. What happens next? You log the supplemental evidence. You verify chain of custody. You request restricted witness access through the review board. You do it cleanly, Captain. No shortcuts because the name is yours. That last part cut through him. Ethan Brooks had built a career on rules. Now the one case that mattered most was asking him to obey them when his hands wanted to tear through every locked cabinet in the building. He set Daniel's photograph on the counter with care and reached for the evidence intake form. His handwriting was steady for the first 3 lines. On the 4th, where the form asked for subject name, he stopped. Daniel Brooks. For 7 years, writing that name had meant absence. Today, for the first time, it meant movement. Grace watched him write, her expression unreadable. The silver shield and eagle wing on her chest caught the fluorescent light, bright against the torn edge beside it. Ethan noticed the contrast again and understood what he had missed when she walked in. She had kept the badge polished because honor still had to be maintained. She had kept the name tape torn because some damage was not failure. Some damage was testimony. When he finished, he slid the form toward her for witness confirmation. Grace signed in a clean, controlled hand. Lieutenant Commander Grace Walker. Ethan looked at the full name, then at the frayed cloth that showed only half of it. Why never replace it, he asked. Grace capped the pen. Because Daniel told me the last thing a name needs is to look perfect to be remembered. Ethan had no answer for that. He only picked up the photograph, placed it inside a new evidence sleeve, and sealed it with both hands. The evidence sleeve made a soft plastic sound as Ethan Brooks pressed the seal flat with his thumb. It was a small motion, almost administrative, the kind he had done thousands of times without feeling anything. This time, his hand stayed there longer than necessary. Inside the sleeve, Daniel's photograph looked both protected and impossibly far away, as if a thin layer of clear plastic had become another 7 years. Grace Walker watched him from across the counter, her face composed, her shoulders square, the torn name tape resting beside the polished silver shield and eagle wing like 2 truths that had learned to stand together. The records office began to move again beyond the closed front area. A phone rang once in the back. A printer warmed itself with a low mechanical hum. Rain softened against the glass. Normal sound returned carefully, as if the building understood it had interrupted something private. Ethan filled out the next section of the intake form, then stopped at the box marked Family Notification Status. For a long moment, the pen did not move. Grace saw the hesitation. Do not call your mother from this office, she said. Ethan looked up. You do not get to tell me that. No, Grace said. But Daniel asked me to protect what reached his family. That includes how it reaches them. The words steadied him more than comfort would have. Comfort invited collapse. Grace offered structure. Ethan set the pen down. She still keeps his room the same. Grace's expression softened by the smallest degree. He told me she would. Ethan looked at the photograph again. He talked about us? More than he admitted. For the first time since the file opened, something almost human crossed Ethan's mouth. Not a smile, but the memory of one. That sounds like him. Grace turned one of the pages in the file and slid a copy toward him. The upper half was redacted, but the lower section showed a clean handwritten note in block letters. Tell Ethan he was right about the Lake Compass. Ethan stared at the sentence. His face changed completely. Rank, office, procedure, and restraint all fell away for one unguarded second. He touched the words with 2 fingers without pressing down. No one knew about that, he said. Grace waited. Ethan's voice became quieter. We were kids. Daniel got us lost near my uncle's cabin because he insisted moss could guide us better than a compass. I told him he was wrong for 2 hours. He never admitted it. The old memory moved through the room with a gentleness that made the silence ache. Grace nodded once. He admitted it later. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, then opened them before the emotion could take more than he was ready to give. Why was this not sent? Because the statement was attached to a witness packet placed under operational hold. When the primary review closed, everything connected to it stopped moving. And nobody checked? Grace's eyes held his. Somebody checked. He understood what she meant. She had checked. Again and again. Through returned requests, procedural denials, deferred reviews, and rooms full of people who saw damaged cloth before they saw the officer wearing it. Ethan looked at her torn name tape one more time, and shame returned, quieter now, more useful. I treated you like an error on a form. Grace did not deny it. Yes. He nodded, accepting the weight without defense. I am sorry, Lieutenant Commander. Grace studied him. For the name tape? For assuming damage meant carelessness. That answer reached closer. She picked up the pen and signed the witness verification line below his entry. Then make the record cleaner than your first impression. Ethan took the form back, squared it with the folder, and opened a secure terminal behind the counter. His movements changed. Not rushed. Not emotional. Precise. He logged the supplemental evidence number, entered Daniel's name, cross-referenced the legacy case identifier, and requested restricted review access under his own authority. Each keystroke sounded small, but Grace knew what it meant. A closed file was learning to breathe again. When the confirmation screen appeared, Ethan read it twice before speaking. The board will receive the request within the hour. Good. And if they deny it? Grace's answer came without hesitation. Then we appeal with cleaner evidence. Ethan looked at her. We. Grace gathered the loose pages and aligned their edges with careful hands. I did not carry this for 7 years to leave at the first locked door. Outside, the rain began to ease. Light pressed through the clouds in thin gray bands. Ethan stood with one hand on the sealed evidence sleeve and the other beside Daniel's name on the form. For the first time in years, his brother was not only missing in a file. He was present in a process. Grace closed the folder gently. Now you can call your mother, she said. Not with answers. With honesty. Ethan swallowed, then nodded. What should I say? Grace looked at the photograph, then at him. Tell her Daniel's name moved today. Ethan Brooks did not call his mother from the front counter. He carried the phone into the small conference room beside the records office, the one with 6 chairs, a wall clock, and a window looking out over the wet parking lot. Grace Walker stayed outside the door with the file secured under her hand, close enough to protect the process, far enough to give a family its first honest breath in 7 years. Through the glass, she saw Ethan stand with the phone at his ear, shoulders squared at first, then slowly lowering as a voice on the other end answered. He did not pace. He did not sit. He listened, then spoke carefully, the way a man speaks when every word must cross a bridge already weakened by time. Grace could not hear the conversation, but she did not need to. She knew the shape of it. There would be hope and fear of hope. There would be questions no one could answer yet. There would be a mother trying to understand how one photograph could arrive 7 years late and still feel like a hand reaching through the dark. Grace looked down at her torn name tape while she waited. Walk. For letters left clean enough to read. The rest frayed into threads that had darkened slightly with age, repaired at the edges but never replaced. People had asked about it before, some with curiosity, some with judgment. Most forgot the moment they looked away. Daniel had not forgotten names. That was what stayed with her after all these years. In the final hour she was allowed to describe, when the record turned blurry and orders narrowed into survival of the truth, Daniel had cared about a photograph, a family joke about a lake compass, and whether his brother would know he had not disappeared quietly inside paperwork. The conference room door opened. Ethan stepped out with his phone still in his hand. His face was pale, but steadier than before. "She wants to know if the photo is real," he said. Grace nodded. "It is." She asked if she can see it. "After evidence, imaging, and release authorization. I will help push that through." Ethan looked at the file beneath her hand. "She cried when I told her his name moved today." Grace did not answer quickly. Some sentences deserved space. "Then you told her correctly." Ethan leaned one shoulder against the wall, not from weakness, but from the weight of finally having somewhere to put what he had carried alone. "She remembered you." Grace's eyes shifted to him. "Me? Not your name." A voice. "Years ago, there was one call from command after the initial notice. A woman said the review was not finished. My mother held on to that for months. Everyone told her it was standard language. She said it sounded like a promise." Grace looked toward the rain-streaked window. Her expression remained controlled, but something behind it moved. It was. Ethan's gaze dropped to the torn name tape. He no longer looked at it like a defect. He looked at it like a witness he had not known how to question. "Why did you let me talk to you that way?" he asked. "Because correcting your manners would not have reopened Daniel's file. You should have corrected both." Grace almost smiled, but it faded before it became one. "Maybe." They returned to the counter together. The clerks came back quietly, sensing without being told that the room had changed. Ethan placed Daniel's sealed photograph into the evidence tray, scanned the intake code, and watched the system mark it received. Then he removed his own identification card, swiped into the restricted archive terminal, and entered the request for an urgent family-linked review. Grace stood beside him, silent, but not passive. When one field asked for justification, Ethan paused only a moment before typing. Supplemental witness evidence establishes last confirmed alive status after prior official contact time. Potential notification deficiency requires immediate board review. He read it once, then submitted. The screen loaded slowly. Rainwater ticked from the roof outside. Somewhere in the back office, a copier warmed and clicked. Then the status appeared, expedited review pending. Ethan exhaled, not in relief, but in recognition that the first locked door had finally opened a crack. He turned to Grace. "Lieutenant Commander Walker." She looked at him. "Captain, I am going to say this once now, and then I am going to spend the rest of this review making sure it was not just words. I was wrong." Grace held his gaze. "Yes, you were." He nodded. "No defense. No explanation. Thank you for not giving up on his name." Grace touched the edge of the file, then the torn cloth above her pocket. "I did not carry it alone." Ethan looked at the 4 visible letters on her uniform. For the first time, he understood that the missing letters did not make the name incomplete. They made him look closer. The expedited review did not stay quiet for long. Within 20 minutes, Ethan Brooks received 3 secure notifications, one from the review board, one from the archive control officer, and one from a senior legal advisor who wanted to know why a 7-year-old closed case had suddenly moved before noon on a rainy Thursday. He answered each message with the same disciplined precision he had once used to keep emotion out of his work. Only now the discipline had a different purpose. It was not protecting distance. It was protecting the truth. Grace Walker stood at the side table, reviewing the copied index sheet while the records office worked around her in a changed rhythm. The clerks who had avoided eye contact earlier now handled the file with careful hands. No one mentioned her torn name tape. No one stared at it for long. But every person in the room knew it had become part of the case in a way no regulation could measure. Ethan looked up from the secure terminal. "The board wants a preliminary statement before close of business." Grace nodded. "They will." "From you?" "Yes." "And from me." She looked at him. "You are the intake authority." Ethan leaned back slightly, absorbing the title as responsibility instead of position. "They're going to ask why I requested urgency. Tell them the truth." He glanced toward the evidence tray, where Daniel's photograph waited in its sealed sleeve. "That my brother's case was mishandled?" Grace's voice stayed even. "That the evidence suggests a notification deficiency and an incomplete witness record." Let the review prove the rest. Ethan almost smiled at the restraint. You really do not give shortcuts. Shortcuts are how names get lost. That ended the argument before it began. Ethan opened a blank statement form and began typing. His first version sounded too angry. He deleted it. His second version sounded too careful. He deleted that too. Grace did not interrupt. She let him find the line between brother and officer because no one else could walk it for him. Finally, he wrote with clean language and steady hands, documenting the file condition, the supplemental evidence, the photograph, the handwritten note, the prior contact discrepancy, and the need for review board action. When he finished, he turned the monitor slightly toward Grace. She read without touching the keyboard. Good, she said. Too emotional? No, too cold. No, she looked at him then. It sounds like someone finally keeping the door open. Ethan submitted the statement. A confirmation number appeared. He wrote it on the case cover by hand, then stopped when he noticed the ink line passing close to Daniel's name. His hand slowed, careful now in ways that would have seemed unnecessary that morning. Grace saw it and said nothing. Respect often arrived first in the small movements. The side door opened and Commander Rachel Monroe, the archive control officer, stepped in with a tablet tucked against her chest. She was in her late 40s, composed, and known for treating records like structural steel. Her eyes moved from Ethan to Grace, then to the torn name tape, then to the silver shield and eagle wing. She did not smile. Lieutenant Commander Walker. Grace stood straighter. Commander Monroe. Ethan noticed the recognition. You know each other? Monroe looked at him. I know of her. That was all she said, and it was enough to change the temperature in the room again. Monroe approached the counter and reviewed the evidence intake. This file was supposed to remain dormant unless new material evidence appeared. Ethan gestured to the sealed photograph. It did. Monroe studied the photo through the clear sleeve. Her expression did not move, but her fingers tightened around the tablet. Where has this been? Grace answered before Ethan could. With me. Monroe looked up. For 7 years? Yes, Commander. Why was it not surrendered earlier? Ethan turned toward Grace, but she did not look at him. She had expected this question. Because earlier submissions were returned before intake. This is the first time the evidence has been accepted into the chain. Monroe's eyes shifted to Ethan. The silence asked more than words could. Ethan held it. That failure ends today, he said. Monroe studied him for a long second, measuring whether he meant it as Daniel's brother or as a captain. Maybe both was finally acceptable. She tapped the tablet and authorized the next step. Then we preserve it correctly. The scanner table was cleared. Gloves were issued. The photograph was imaged front and back under archival light. Daniel's smile appeared on the monitor, enlarged but still painfully human. The handwritten words filled the screen next. Daniel Brooks. Last confirmed alive. No one spoke while the image saved. Grace watched from a few feet away, her face still, her eyes carrying distance. Ethan looked from the screen to her torn name tape. He trusted you, he said quietly. Grace kept her gaze on the monitor. He trusted the name would reach home. Monroe sealed the original again and placed it in a locked evidence case. The click of the latch sounded final, but not closed. Opened correctly. Ethan took a breath and looked at Grace. The board will ask for your statement next. Grace nodded. Then they should hear it before the day ends. Monroe stepped aside, giving her the chair. Grace sat at the terminal, the torn name tape visible above the desk edge, the silver badge bright under the office lights. She placed her hands on the keyboard and began not with drama, not with accusation, but with the first line that had survived every denial. I was present when Daniel Brooks was last confirmed alive. Grace Walker typed the statement without looking at the faces behind her. If she looked at Ethan Brooks too long, she would see the brother waiting inside the officer. If she looked at Commander Monroe too long, she would see the archive system preparing to defend its own history before it admitted what it had missed. So she kept her eyes on the screen and gave the truth the cleanest path she could. I was present when Daniel Brooks was last confirmed alive. She continued from there, one sentence at a time, steady and exact. She described the authorized location without naming what remained restricted. She identified the time window, the transfer of personal material, the condition of the file cover, the reason the photograph had been preserved outside the original packet, and the prior attempts to submit supplemental evidence. She did not use heroic language. She did not describe fear. She did not turn Daniel into a symbol before the record finished treating him like a man. Ethan stood near the evidence case and listened to the keys. Each tap sounded controlled, but he understood now that control was not emptiness. It was effort. Grace paused only once, when the statement reached the line requiring personal witness context. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard. The room held still. Then she wrote. Daniel Brooks stated his intent that family be informed he was alive after the last recorded contact point. Ethan turned away for a second, not to hide from the sentence, but to survive receiving it in public. Commander Monroe lowered her tablet. The scanner light went dark. Rain had stopped outside, leaving the windows streaked and bright with late afternoon gray. Grace finished the statement, attached the evidence reference number, added her digital signature, and submitted it to the review board. The confirmation appeared almost instantly. Statement received. Pending board examination. She leaned back from the keyboard, but only slightly. 7 years had taught her not to confuse submission with acceptance. Monroe stepped forward and reviewed the screen. This is enough to require a board session. Ethan looked at her. When? They will schedule within 72 hours. Grace shook her head once. No, Monroe turned. No. Grace stood. The torn name tape came fully into view above the desk edge, frayed but steady, the polished silver shield and eagle wing beside it catching the last weak light from the window. The family has waited 7 years. The evidence has already been delayed through 5 failed intake attempts. The photograph is verified. The witness statement is submitted. The intake authority is present. The archive control officer is present. This does not need 72 hours to become important. Monroe's eyes narrowed, but not with anger. You are requesting immediate preliminary review. I am requesting the standard be applied without the comfort of delay. Ethan looked at Grace, and something like respect deepened into trust. She was not asking for special treatment for Daniel. She was asking the system to do what it had promised everyone. Monroe studied the file, then the evidence case, then Ethan. Captain Brooks, can you separate family interest from intake duty for a live board call? Ethan answered carefully. No. Grace looked at him. Monroe waited. Ethan continued. I cannot separate them, but I can document both, disclose both, and recuse myself from any decision beyond evidence intake if required. Monroe held his gaze. Then she nodded once. That is the correct answer. She opened her tablet and placed the request. The next 10 minutes moved with quiet speed. A secure conference room was prepared. The file was transferred under dual custody. The photograph remained sealed inside the evidence case. Ethan called his mother again, not to promise an outcome, only to tell her the review would begin that day. Grace stood by the window while he spoke. Outside, the clouds had thinned over the base, and water shone on the pavement like polished steel. When the call ended, Ethan walked back to her. She asked if he would be there. Grace did not answer immediately. Does she know who I am? She knows you are the woman who kept trying. That was heavier than rank, heavier than apology. Grace looked down once at her torn name tape. Then I will be there. The board call began at 1630 hours in a windowless room with a long table for secure screens and a flag standing silent in the corner. 3 board members appeared by video. Monroe presented the chain of custody. Ethan gave the intake summary, voice controlled, disclosure clear. Then Grace stepped forward. No one in the room mentioned the torn cloth on her uniform. Not anymore. One board member asked, Lieutenant Commander Walker, why did you preserve this material after the original case closed? Grace looked at Daniel's photograph sealed in the case, then at Ethan, then back to the screen. Because the case closed before the truth finished speaking. The room went silent. This time, the silence did not bury the name. It made room for it. The board member's question remained in the air longer than the answer. Grace Walker stood at the end of the secure conference table with her hands relaxed at her sides, the torn name tape visible above her pocket, the silver shield and eagle wing polished bright beside it. On the screen, 3 officers reviewed the submitted statement in silence. Commander Monroe stood near the evidence case. Ethan Brooks sat across from Grace with his notebook open, but his pen had stopped moving. For once, he was not trying to force the truth into boxes before it was ready. The senior board member leaned closer to his camera. Lieutenant Commander Walker, are you stating that the original closure decision was premature? Grace did not blink. I am stating that available witness material was not included before closure. It was the disciplined answer, sharp enough to cut without becoming accusation. Monroe gave the smallest approving nod. The board member looked down at his copy of the evidence log. And you attempted submission 5 times. Yes, sir. Why continue after repeated denial? Grace's eyes moved briefly to the sealed photograph. Because Daniel Brooks asked that his family know he was alive after the record said silence began. Ethan lowered his eyes, not in shame this time, but in respect for the weight of that sentence. The board conferred off-screen. No one in the room moved. The clock on the wall marked each second with a small mechanical click. At last, the senior board member returned. The board finds sufficient basis to reopen the Brooks legacy case for immediate supplemental review. Family notification deficiency will be examined. Prior witness intake handling will be audited. The photograph and statement will remain preserved under restricted chain of custody. Ethan closed his eyes for 1 second. Not relief. Not closure. A door had opened, and beyond it was still a long hallway. But it was open. Grace accepted the ruling without visible reaction, because the name on the file deserved more than a moment of personal victory. Thank you, sir, she said. The call ended at 1,712 hours. The screens went dark. For several seconds, the room stayed silent, as if everyone understood that official language had just moved a family's grief from waiting into motion. Monroe locked the evidence case and signed the transfer log. Captain Brooks, you will receive the board's written order within the hour. Lieutenant Commander Walker, your full witness packet will be requested under secure review. Grace nodded. Understood. Monroe paused at the door and looked once more at the torn name tape. For what it is worth, she said, I would not replace it either. Then she left. Ethan remained seated until the door closed. When he stood, he looked different than he had that morning. Not healed, not even close, but corrected. He picked up his notebook, then set it down again, as if rank and procedure could wait for one human sentence. Lieutenant Commander Walker, he said, voice steady but low. I am sorry for how I spoke to you when you walked in. Grace looked at him. You already apologized. Not correctly. He faced her fully. I mocked a piece of your uniform because I thought standards were only about appearance. I did not ask what the damage meant. I did not ask what the name had carried. I made myself smaller and tried to call it discipline. Grace let the words stand. This time, they were clean enough to matter. Accepted, she said. Ethan swallowed once. My mother asked if she could thank you someday. Grace's expression shifted, almost imperceptibly. Someday, when the file allows it. She also asked what your full name was. Grace glanced down at the torn tape, where only Walk remained clear. Tell her Grace Walker. Ethan gave a quiet nod. I will. They walked back through the records office together. The clerks looked up, not with curiosity now, but with a kind of restrained respect that did not need ceremony. The rain had stopped. Outside the front windows, the pavement shone under the pale evening light. Grace gathered the remaining copies into the transfer folder, aligned each edge, and secured the tie. Ethan watched her hands move with the same care she had shown from the moment she arrived. He understood now that she had never been careless. She had been carrying something fragile through a system that kept asking it to prove it deserved to exist. At the front counter, he hesitated. Why did Daniel give it to you? Grace looked at the sealed file, then toward the window. Because he knew I would keep walking. Ethan followed her gaze to the reflection in the glass. His uniform clean, her name tape torn, both of them standing beside a file that had finally begun to breathe again. Some names survive because someone refuses to let them be filed away, she said. Ethan nodded slowly. And some people were the proof. Grace touched the frayed edge of the cloth once, then let her hand fall. A name does not need perfect stitching to deserve respect. She turned and walked toward the exit, her steps quiet across the polished floor, the silver shield and eagle wing catching the last light of the day. Behind her, Ethan Brooks picked up the phone to call his mother again. This time, he did not call with an apology, a rumor, or another empty update. He called with the truth moving forward. And for the first time in 7 years, Daniel Brooks was not just missing in a closed file. His name was alive in the hands of people finally willing to read it correctly.